They called me a failure who couldn't make it in the real world, but that day when General Morrison walked into our family dinner and said, "Respect the founder," everything changed. The autumn rain drummed against the dining room windows as my mother set another place at the table. My siblings exchanged those familiar glances. The ones that said, "Here comes another lecture about my wasted potential." Before I share what happened next, I want to know you're here with me. Just say listening in the comments or let me know where you're watching from. These stories travel further than I ever imagined. Still living in that tiny apartment downtown, my brother Marcus asked, cutting his steak with theatrical precision. Sarah, my younger sister, laughed that sharp laugh she'd perfected since high school. At least he's not asking Dad for money anymore. The words stung because they weren't entirely wrong. I had been struggling. After 8 years in the army, civilian life felt like speaking a foreign language. What they didn't know was why I kept those late-night phone calls brief. Why I drove that beat-up Honda instead of something newer. Why I dressed in simple clothes and lived modestly. They saw failure where something else entirely was growing. "Remember when you said you'd make something of yourself?" Sarah continued, serving herself more wine. "That was what, 3 years ago?" Mom tried to intervene with talk about the weather, but Marcus wasn't finished. "Some of us actually built careers, jobs with benefits, retirement plans." I nodded quietly, the way I always did. The way I'd learned to do. My phone buzzed against my leg. Another message I couldn't answer. Not here. Not now. The sender's name would have meant nothing to them anyway. Defense contracts weren't dinner conversation in our house. "You could still go back to school," Dad offered gently. He meant well. They all did, in their way. Community college has that veterans program. I smiled and thanked him, knowing I already held degrees they'd never heard about. Degrees earned while building something they couldn't imagine. The doorbell rang through their familiar chorus of disappointment. Mom looked confused. "We're not expecting anyone." Through the front window, I caught a glimpse of the black sedan in our driveway. Military plates. My stomach dropped. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not here. Not tonight. "I'll get it," I offered, standing quickly. But Dad was already at the door, his voice carrying back to us with surprise and something approaching awe. "Well, I'll be damned. General Morrison." The dining room fell silent. Even Sarah's wine glass paused halfway to her lips. General Morrison stepped into our modest dining room wearing his dress blues, for stars gleaming on his shoulders. His presence filled our small dining room like electricity before a storm. "Sir," I said automatically, the military bearing returning to my spine without conscious thought. My family stared in confusion as I straightened, shoulders back, chin level. They'd never seen me stand like that before. "At ease, son," General Morrison said, but his eyes held something I hadn't expected. Recognition mixed with what looked like surprise. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by. His gaze swept the room, taking in my family's bewildered faces. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Mom recovered first, as mothers do. "Not at all, General. Please, join us for dinner." She was already pulling out the chair beside mine, the good china appearing as if by magic. My siblings remained frozen, probably wondering how their failure of a brother knew a 4-star general. "Thank you, ma'am, but I can't stay long." He settled into the chair anyway, his ribbons catching the light. "I was just telling my aide about the remarkable work being done by veterans in the private sector these days." His eyes found mine again. "Some of the most innovative defense solutions are coming from people who understand the real needs in the field." Sarah cleared her throat. "How do you know our brother, General?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I could feel everyone's attention focus on me, waiting for an explanation I couldn't give. "Not yet. Not like this. We've crossed paths professionally," he said carefully. Too carefully. My father leaned forward, interested now in a way he hadn't been in years. "What kind of professional work?" The question I'd been dreading. 3 years ago, I'd walked out of the army with nothing but a duffel bag and an idea. The idea had come during my second deployment, watching good soldiers work with equipment that should have been better. Gear that failed when it mattered most. Communication systems that went dark at the worst possible moments. I'd spent my savings, every penny of my military pay, on a workshop in an industrial district downtown. Those first months I lived on ramen and coffee, sketching designs by lamplight, teaching myself engineering principles I'd never learned in formal classes. My family thought I was lost, drifting, unable to adjust to civilian life. They weren't entirely wrong. I was adjusting, just not in the way they expected. While Marcus climbed corporate ladders and Sarah built her marketing career, I was building something else. Something that started with one small contract to improve radio encryption for forward operating bases. The defense industry is changing, General Morrison continued, accepting the glass of water Mom offered. The best innovations aren't coming from the big corporations anymore. They're coming from small companies, veteran-owned businesses that understand what troops actually need. My phone buzzed again. This time I glanced at it. The message was from Colonel Williams at the Pentagon. The prototype testing results were in. Positive. Better than positive. Revolutionary, according to the engineers who'd run the trials. Our brother isn't in the defense industry, Marcus said with that familiar, condescending tone. He works odd jobs, lives paycheck to paycheck. The words hit me like they always did, even though I knew better now. Even though my company's revenue last quarter had exceeded his annual salary. General Morrison's eyebrows raised slightly. Is that so? He looked at me with something that might have been amusement. Sometimes the most important work happens quietly, behind the scenes. The kind of work that doesn't make headlines but saves lives. Dad was studying me now with new interest. Son, what exactly have you been doing these past 3 years? The question I'd been avoiding, the conversation I'd postponed too many times. How do you explain that the failure they pitted had built something extraordinary? I've been consulting, I said finally. It wasn't a lie, just an incomplete truth. Working with military contractors on equipment improvements. The understatement of the century, but it was a start. Consulting, Sarah repeated, as if the word tasted strange. What kind of consulting? Before I could answer, General Morrison's phone rang. He glanced at it, then at me, then back at the phone. Excuse me, he said, standing. I need to take this. He stepped toward the window, but I caught fragments of his conversation. Words like successful demonstration and full production approval and the founder will be pleased. When he returned to the table, something had changed in his expression. He looked at me differently now, as if seeing me clearly for the first time tonight. That was the Pentagon, he said, settling back into his chair. They've just approved full production of the new tactical communication system. He paused, his gaze finding mine across the table. The one that's going to save countless lives in the field. My heart stopped. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. Not here, not now, not in front of my family who still saw me as their biggest disappointment. But General Morrison continued, his voice carrying the weight of authority that comes with 4 stars. The system was developed by a small company right here in the city. Veteran-owned, innovative, absolutely brilliant work. He turned to face my parents directly. Your son's company. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus's fork clattered against his plate. Sarah's wine glass remained suspended halfway to her lips, forgotten. Dad's eyes moved between the general and me, searching for understanding. I'm sorry, Mom said slowly, but there must be some mistake. Our son doesn't own a company. Her voice carried that patient tone she used when correcting misunderstandings. He works odd jobs, lives in a small apartment. General Morrison smiled, the kind of smile that comes from knowing something others don't. Ma'am, your son founded Tactical Solutions 3 years ago. His company just received a $50 million contract to equip every forward operating base in our overseas operations. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. 50 million, Sarah whispered, finally setting down her wine glass. Dollars. That's just the initial contract, General Morrison continued. The full implementation over 5 years will exceed 200 million. He looked at me with something approaching pride. Your son has revolutionized battlefield communications. His encryption protocols are years ahead of anything we've seen. Marcus found his voice first. But he drives that old Honda. Lives in that tiny apartment. The words came out confused, almost pleading. As if the general might take back what he'd said if presented with enough evidence of my failure. Smart business practices, General Morrison replied. Keep overhead low, reinvest profits into research and development. Classic veteran mindset. Focus on the mission, not the flash. He stood, straightening his uniform. I should mention, your son turned down 3 acquisition offers last year. Companies wanted to buy him out for more money than most people see in a lifetime. Dad was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. Is this true? The question came out rough, uncertain. You own a defense contracting company? I nodded slowly. I wanted to tell you. I just didn't know how. The truth was more complicated. How do you explain that you stayed quiet because their doubt had become familiar? That their low expectations had become a comfortable place to hide? The encryption system your son developed, General Morrison continued, prevented a major security breach just last month. Intelligence analysts estimate it saved hundreds of American lives. He extended his hand to me. On behalf of the United States military, thank you for your service. Both in uniform and out. I stood and shook his hand, feeling my family's eyes on us both. Just doing my job, sir. No, he said firmly. You're doing exceptional work. The kind of work that wins wars and brings soldiers home safely. He turned back to my family. You should be incredibly proud. Your son is making a difference on a scale most people can't imagine. After General Morrison left, the dining room felt different. Smaller somehow, but also charged with new possibility. My family sat in stunned silence, processing everything they'd learned. The failure they'd pitted for 3 years was actually more successful than any of them. Why didn't you tell us? Mom asked finally, her voice soft with hurt and confusion. Because I needed you to love me without it, I said simply. I needed to know that your disappointment wasn't really about money or success. I needed to build something for the right reasons. Sarah was crying quietly, her mascara smudging. We're so sorry. We had no idea. You weren't supposed to, I replied, reaching across to squeeze her hand. But now you do. Dad cleared his throat, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Son, I owe you an apology. We all do. No apologies needed, I said, meaning it. You raised me to serve something bigger than myself. I'm just glad I found a way to keep serving. The rain had stopped outside. Through the window, I could see stars beginning to appear between the clouds. Tomorrow, everything would be different. But tonight, for the first time in years, I was exactly where I belonged. As we sat together in the quiet aftermath of truth, I realized something important. The validation I'd been seeking wasn't in their recognition of my success. It was in their love, which had been there all along, hidden beneath their worry and disappointment. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't about proving others wrong. Sometimes they're about finally allowing yourself to be seen for who you really are. If this story touched you, think about the people in your life who might be fighting battles you can't see. Sometimes the quiet ones are changing the world in ways we never notice. Until the moment we finally do. They called me selfish when I hesitated to give my liver, but that day when Dr. Vasquez looked at the DNA results and said you saved someone who shares no blood with you, everything changed. The fluorescent lights of City General Hospital buzzed overhead as I stood in the transplant coordinator's office, my hands still trembling from the phone call that had shattered my quiet Tuesday morning. Sarah was dying, they said, and I was her only hope. The irony wasn't lost on me that after 28 years of being the family disappointment, I was suddenly the most important person in their world. Before I share what really happened in that sterile room, I want to know you are here with me. Just say listening in the comments or let me know where you are tuning in from. I love hearing how far these stories of hidden truth can reach. My phone had been buzzing insistently as I restocked supplies in the hospital's equipment room, my daily routine as a medical technician interrupted by the kind of emergency that changes everything. Mom's voice was shaking when I finally answered, her words tumbling over each other in panic. Sarah had collapsed at work, rushed to the emergency room, and the doctors were saying things like acute liver failure and critical condition. I could hear Dad in the background, his voice strained as he spoke to what sounded like medical staff, and for the first time in years, I heard genuine fear in my parents' voices. The drive to the hospital felt like traveling through fog, even though the October sky was crystal clear above the city. I had grown up in the shadow of my sister's achievements, watching from the sidelines as she collected academic awards, athletic trophies, and our parents' endless praise. Sarah was everything I wasn't, everything I could never be, and somewhere along the way, I had made peace with being the other child, the one who worked quietly in the background while she shined in the spotlight. But now she needed me, and despite everything, despite the years of feeling invisible in my own family, I would do whatever it took to save her. The emergency room was chaos when I arrived, but I knew these hallways better than most. 3 years of working as a technician had given me access to the inner workings of City General, and I used my badge to navigate through the maze of gurneys and worried families. I found my parents in the surgical consultation area, huddled together on uncomfortable plastic chairs, looking smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen them. Mom's makeup was streaked with tears, and Dad's usually perfect hair was disheveled from running his hands through it repeatedly. Dr. Martinez, the hepatologist, was explaining Sarah's condition with the kind of gentle precision that medical professionals use when delivering devastating news. Her liver was failing rapidly, damaged by what appeared to be an autoimmune reaction that had escalated beyond what medication could control. Without a transplant, she had days, maybe a week at most. The waiting list for donor organs was long, and Sarah's blood type made finding a match even more challenging. That's when Dr. Martinez looked directly at me and asked the question that would change everything. Would I be willing to be tested as a potential living donor? The words hung in the air like a challenge, and I could feel my parents' eyes on me, measuring my response. This was my moment to prove that I wasn't the disappointment they had always seen me as, the son who had chosen a technical job over a professional career, who lived in a small apartment instead of the suburban dream they had envisioned for both their children. I nodded without hesitation, though something deep in my chest felt heavy with the weight of unspoken expectations. The testing process began immediately, a series of blood draws and medical evaluations that would determine if I was a suitable match for Sarah. As we waited in the family conference room, I watched my parents hover over my sister's unconscious form through the glass partition. Even in crisis, their attention was entirely focused on her, their golden child who had graduated summa cum laude from law school and was already making partner track at one of the city's most prestigious firms. I was just the backup plan, the spare parts brother who had finally found his purpose. Mom kept glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and expectation. She had never looked at me that way before, with such focused attention, and part of me wondered if this was what it felt like to be truly seen by her own mother. But there was something else in her eyes, a flicker of something that looked almost like guilt, though I couldn't understand why she would feel guilty about asking me to save my sister's life. The preliminary blood work came back within hours, and Dr. Martinez's expression was cautiously optimistic when he called us back into his office. My blood type was compatible, and the initial screening showed promising signs that I could be a viable donor. However, he explained, living liver donation was major surgery with significant risks, and I needed to understand exactly what I was volunteering for. Part of my liver would be removed and transplanted into Sarah, and while the liver regenerates, the recovery process would be long and potentially complicated. I listened to the medical details with the kind of focused attention that came from working in healthcare, understanding the risks in a way that perhaps my parents couldn't fully grasp. There was a chance of bleeding, infection, bile duct complications, and even death, though Dr. Martinez assured us that the mortality rate for living donors was less than 1%. Still, I would be trading my health and safety for Sarah's life, and everyone in that room knew it was not a decision to be made lightly. That evening, as Sarah remained unconscious in the ICU, my parents and I sat in the hospital cafeteria, picking at sandwiches none of us really wanted to eat. The conversation was stilted, filled with the kind of awkward pauses that come when a family suddenly has to address feelings they have spent years avoiding. Mom kept thanking me, her voice thick with emotion, but there was something hollow about her gratitude, as if she were reading from a script she had never rehearsed. Dad was more direct, in his typically analytical way. He wanted to know about my job, whether I could take extended medical leave, and how this would affect my future career prospects. It struck me as odd that he was more concerned about the practical implications than the emotional weight of what I was about to do. Even in this moment of crisis, he seemed unable to acknowledge the magnitude of my sacrifice, focusing instead on logistics and timelines. I found myself thinking about our childhood, about the countless times Sarah had been celebrated while my achievements went unnoticed. When she made honor roll, there were family dinners and photo sessions. When I completed my medical technician certification, barely anyone remembered to congratulate me. She got the car for her 16th birthday, the college fund, the down payment on her first apartment. I got the message that I was expected to figure things out on my own, that somehow I was inherently less deserving of their investment and attention. But now I was the one with something they needed, something that couldn't be bought or earned through traditional success. My liver, my blood, my willingness to undergo major surgery, these were things only I could provide. For the first time in my adult life, I was indispensable to my family, and the feeling was both empowering and deeply unsettling. The next morning brought a flurry of additional tests and consultations with the transplant team. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the head of transplant surgery, took over my case with the kind of thorough professionalism that immediately inspired confidence. She was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and intelligent dark eyes, someone who had clearly spent decades making life-and-death decisions with remarkable skill. When she spoke to me, she looked directly into my eyes in a way that made me feel like she was seeing me as a person, not just a collection of potentially useful organs. The psychological evaluation was perhaps the most challenging part of the screening process. The hospital's social worker, Mrs. Chin, wanted to make sure I fully understood what I was volunteering for and that I wasn't being coerced by family pressure. She asked probing questions about my relationship with Sarah, about my motivations for donating, and about my support system during recovery. I found myself struggling to articulate feelings I had never really examined, trying to explain why I was willing to risk my life for a sister who had barely acknowledged my existence for most of our lives. During one of these sessions, Mrs. Chin asked me directly if I felt pressured by my parents to donate. The question caught me off guard, and I had to think carefully about my answer. Was I being pressured, or was this simply the right thing to do? The line between family obligation and genuine choice seemed blurrier than I had initially realized. I told her that I wanted to save Sarah because she was my sister, because family takes care of family, but even as I said the words, I wondered if I truly believed them. Sarah regained consciousness on the third day, though she was groggy from medications and the progression of her liver failure. When I visited her room, she looked smaller than I remembered, her normally vibrant complexion replaced by the yellowish tinge of jaundice. She tried to smile when she saw me, but her eyes were clouded with confusion and fear. The invincible big sister who had always seemed larger than life was suddenly fragile and vulnerable, and I felt a protective instinct I hadn't experienced since we were children. She squeezed my hand weakly and whispered thank you, though I wasn't sure she fully understood what I was offering to do. The medications made conversation difficult, but in her moments of clarity, I could see genuine gratitude in her eyes. This was perhaps the first time in years that she had looked at me without the subtle condescension that had characterized our adult relationship, the implied disappointment that I hadn't lived up to whatever potential she thought I should have achieved. The final medical clearance came on Friday afternoon, and Dr. Vasquez scheduled the surgery for Monday morning. The weekend felt surreal, a strange suspended period where I tried to prepare mentally and physically for what was coming. I cleaned my apartment thoroughly, meal prepped for my recovery period, and arranged for extended leave from work. My supervisor, who knew about my situation, was incredibly supportive and assured me that my job would be waiting when I was ready to return. My parents spent the weekend at the hospital, maintaining their vigil over Sarah while occasionally checking in with me about surgery preparations. I appreciated their concern, but it felt performative, as if they were playing the role of caring parents rather than actually feeling the emotions they were expressing. Mom kept asking if I needed anything, but when I mentioned that I was nervous about the surgery, she quickly redirected the conversation back to Sarah's condition and how grateful we should all be that there was a solution available. On Sunday evening, as I sat in my small living room looking out at the city lights, I found myself thinking about what would happen after the surgery. Would this sacrifice finally earn me the place in my family that I had always craved, or would I simply return to being the invisible son once Sarah recovered and life returned to normal? Part of me hoped that this act of love would change our family dynamics permanently, that perhaps my parents would finally see me as someone worthy of their attention and pride. I had packed a small bag for my hospital stay, including a few books and my laptop, though I doubted I would have much energy for entertainment during the initial recovery period. The preoperative instructions were clear: no food or water after midnight, arrive at the hospital by 6 a.m., and prepare for a surgery that could last anywhere from 4 to 8 hours, depending on complications. Dr. Vasquez had explained that they would be removing approximately 60% of my liver, leaving me with just enough to maintain normal function while my organ regenerated over the following months. The night before surgery, I called my Aunt Linda, my mother's sister who lived across the country. She was the only family member who had ever really understood me, who had encouraged my choice to work in healthcare even when my parents expressed disappointment that I wasn't pursuing a more prestigious career. When I told her about the donation, there was a long pause on the phone, and then she said something that stuck with me. "Marcus, you have such a good heart, but make sure you're doing this for the right reasons." I wasn't entirely sure what she meant by that, but her words echoed in my mind as I tried to fall asleep that night. Was I donating my liver because I genuinely wanted to save Sarah's life, or because I was desperate for my parents' approval and recognition? The truth was probably some combination of both, and I had to make peace with the complexity of my motivations as I prepared to walk into that operating room. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of October rain that makes everything feel somber and significant. I arrived at the hospital early, checking in at the surgical admissions desk with a calmness that surprised me. The preoperative area was bustling with activity, nurses and technicians preparing for what would be a very long day. I was assigned to a bed next to an elderly man who was having his gallbladder removed, and we chatted quietly about our respective surgeries while we waited for our turn in the operating room. My parents arrived just as the anesthesia team was starting my four, their faces drawn with worry and exhaustion from days of stress. Mom kissed my forehead and told me she loved me, words that should have been comforting, but somehow felt hollow, as if she were saying them because the situation demanded it rather than because she genuinely felt them. Dad shook my hand formally and thanked me again for my sacrifice, his businessman's demeanor intact even in this intensely personal moment. Dr. Vasquez appeared in her surgical scrubs, radiating the kind of quiet confidence that comes from years of performing complex procedures. She reviewed the surgical plan one final time, explaining exactly which portion of my liver would be removed and how it would be prepared for transplant into Sarah. The whole process was expected to take about 6 hours, with Sarah's surgery beginning as soon as my liver was successfully harvested. We would be in adjacent operating rooms, connected by the organ that would save her life. As they wheeled me toward the operating room, I caught a glimpse of Sarah being prepared for her own surgery. She was already sedated, looking peaceful despite the yellow tinge of her skin and the various monitors attached to her body. In that moment, seeing her so vulnerable and dependent on what I was about to give her, I felt a surge of love and protectiveness that reminded me why I was doing this. Whatever complicated feelings existed between us, whatever resentments I might harbor about our childhood, she was still my sister, and I would do whatever it took to save her life. The operating room was blindingly bright and filled with sophisticated equipment that I recognized from my work in the hospital. The surgical team moved with practiced efficiency, each person knowing exactly their role in the complex procedure ahead. Dr. Vasquez positioned herself at the head of the table, and as the anesthesia mask was placed over my face, she looked down at me with what seemed like genuine admiration and said, "What you're doing today is truly extraordinary, Marcus." As consciousness faded and the anesthesia took hold, my last thought was about the conversation I had overheard the previous evening between my parents in the hospital hallway. They thought I was sleeping, but I had heard Dad say to Mom, "At least we'll finally be able to put him to good use," and her uncomfortable laugh in response. The words stung, but they also crystallized something I had been feeling for years, the sense that my value to my family was conditional, based on what I could provide rather than who I was as a person. But none of that mattered now as the surgical lights blurred above me and the steady beep of monitors faded into silence. I was about to give a piece of myself to save my sister's life, and whatever happened next, whatever revelations awaited us all, I could at least know that I had acted with love and courage when it mattered most. The operating room disappeared into darkness, and with it, the last moments of the life I had known, because nothing would ever be the same after the truth that was about to emerge from the routine medical tests that would follow the surgery. I woke up in postoperative recovery feeling like I had been hit by a truck, my abdomen wrapped in surgical dressings and connected to more tubes and monitors than I could count. The surgery had taken 7 hours, Dr. Vasquez later told me, longer than expected due to some unexpected scarring, but both procedures had been successful. Sarah was alive, my liver was functioning in her body, and according to the medical team, we were both expected to make full recoveries. The first few days were a blur of pain medication and careful monitoring, with nurses checking my vitals every few hours and gradually helping me regain mobility. My parents maintained their vigil, splitting time between my room and Sarah's, though I noticed they spent considerably more time with her. Even in recovery, even after I had literally given part of my body to save her life, the family hierarchy remained unchanged. I was the dutiful son who had done what was expected, while she remained the precious daughter who deserved their primary attention and concern. Dr. Vasquez visited me every morning during rounds, her presence both professional and oddly comforting. She had a way of looking at me that made me feel like she truly saw me as an individual, not just as a successful surgical case or a source of organs for my sister. During one of these visits, about a week after surgery, she mentioned that they would be doing some routine follow-up blood work to monitor how both Sarah and I were healing and to ensure there were no signs of rejection or complications. I didn't think much about the blood tests at first, assuming they were standard protocol for organ transplant cases. My focus was on managing pain, regaining strength, and slowly returning to normal activities under the careful supervision of the medical team. Physical therapy was challenging, as my abdominal muscles had been significantly impacted by the surgery, but I was determined to recover as quickly and completely as possible. I had always been quietly resilient, and this situation was no different. Sarah's recovery was progressing even better than mine, her new liver function improving dramatically with each passing day. The yellow tinge of jaundice was fading from her skin, and her energy levels were slowly returning to normal. She had visitors constantly, friends from law school, colleagues from her firm, and extended family members who traveled from out of state to check on her condition. My room, by contrast, remained relatively quiet, with only the occasional visit from coworkers and my Aunt Linda, who had flown in from California despite my protests that it wasn't necessary. It was during one of Aunt Linda's visits that she said something that would later prove more significant than either of us realized at the time. She was looking at some old family photos Mom had brought to help decorate my room, pictures from various holidays and family gatherings over the years. Linda paused at one particular photo from Sarah's high school graduation, studying it with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. She murmured something about how Sarah had always looked so different from the rest of the family, how her features didn't really match anyone else's, but then quickly changed the subject when she noticed me watching her. The comment stuck with me, though I couldn't explain why. Sarah had always been different from me, but I had attributed that to her being female, older, and frankly more successful in everything she attempted. Physical differences had never occurred to me as anything unusual, just natural variation between siblings. But something about the way Aunt Linda had studied that photograph, the way she had quickly redirected the conversation, planted a seed of curiosity that would soon grow into something much larger. My parents had been acting strangely since the surgery as well, in ways that were subtle but noticeable to someone who had spent a lifetime reading their moods and reactions. Mom seemed more anxious than usual, frequently checking her phone and having hushed conversations with Dad that stopped abruptly whenever I entered the room. Dad was being unusually attentive to me, asking about my comfort level and recovery progress with an intensity that felt performative rather than genuine. They were both trying too hard to appear normal, and their efforts were having the opposite effect. 2 weeks after surgery, Dr. Vasquez asked me to come to her office for what she described as a routine follow-up consultation. I was walking with minimal assistance by then, my incision healing well and my energy levels gradually improving. The appointment was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon, and I assumed it would be a standard check-in about my recovery progress and any ongoing concerns about the transplant. Her office was located on the hospital's administrative floor, a space I rarely visited during my work as a technician. The walls were covered with medical degrees and professional recognitions, testament to her expertise and years of experience in transplant surgery. She gestured for me to sit in one of the comfortable chairs across from her desk, and I noticed she had a thick file folder in front of her, much larger than what I would have expected for a routine follow-up appointment. Dr. Vasquez began by asking about my physical recovery, my pain levels, and whether I had experienced any unusual symptoms since the surgery. I answered her questions honestly, reporting that while I was still sore and tired easily, I felt like I was healing well and looked forward to returning to work in another few weeks. She made notes in my file as I spoke, but I could sense there was something else on her mind, something more significant than routine postoperative care. Then she opened the thick folder and pulled out what appeared to be laboratory results, several pages of data that meant nothing to me but clearly contained information she found concerning. She looked at me directly and said there had been some unexpected findings in the follow-up blood work, results that she needed to discuss with me before sharing them with the rest of my family. The serious tone of her voice immediately put me on alert, and I found myself bracing for news about complications or rejection issues with the transplant. Instead, she told me something that would fundamentally change everything I thought I knew about my family and my place within it. The genetic compatibility testing that had been done as part of the transplant process had revealed information that went far beyond medical compatibility. According to the DNA analysis, Sarah and I were not biological siblings. In fact, we shared no genetic markers that would indicate any family relationship whatsoever. The words hung in the air between us like a physical presence, and I felt something fundamental shift in my understanding of reality. Not biological siblings. No genetic relationship. The implications of what she was telling me slowly began to penetrate the shock and confusion that had immediately flooded my mind. If Sarah and I weren't related, then one of us had to be adopted, and given my parents' obvious preference for her throughout our lives, the answer seemed clear. Dr. Vasquez continued explaining the science behind the discovery, how routine genetic testing during organ transplant procedures sometimes revealed unexpected family relationships or the absence thereof. She emphasized that this didn't change the success of the surgery or affect either of our recoveries, but it did raise important questions about our family history that would need to be addressed. She had seen cases like this before, she assured me, and while the emotional impact could be significant, the medical aspects remained unchanged. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process information that seemed to overturn everything I had believed about my identity and place in the world. If I wasn't Sarah's biological brother, then who was I really, and why had my parents never told me I was adopted? The pieces of a puzzle I hadn't even known existed began falling into place in my mind. My sense of never quite fitting in, the way my parents had always seemed slightly distant with me, the physical differences that Aunt Linda had noticed in those family photographs. But then another possibility occurred to me, one that was even more shocking than learning I might be adopted. What if I wasn't the adopted child at all? What if Sarah was the one who wasn't biologically related to our parents, and they had simply never told either of us about her adoption? This scenario would explain their preferential treatment of her, their obvious guilt and overcompensation, their desperate attempts to make her feel loved and included in ways that had inadvertently excluded me. Dr. Vasquez seemed to read my thoughts, because she gently suggested that I might want to have a conversation with my parents before drawing any conclusions about who was adopted and when. She offered to facilitate that conversation if I wanted, or to provide additional genetic testing that could clarify the biological relationships between all family members. Whatever I decided, she assured me, The medical team would support me through both the physical and emotional aspects of this discovery. I asked her not to share this information with my parents or Sarah until I had time to process it myself and decide how to handle the situation. She agreed, emphasizing that patient confidentiality meant the decision about disclosure was entirely mine to make. As I left her office that afternoon, walking slowly through the hospital corridors I knew so well, I felt like I was seeing everything through completely different eyes. That evening, I sat in my apartment surrounded by family photographs and mementos, studying them with new awareness of what I was looking for. The differences were subtle but unmistakable once I knew to look for them. Sarah's facial structure, her coloring, her body type, all different from both me and our parents in ways that genetics couldn't easily explain. She had always been taller, with different colored eyes and hair texture that required completely different care products. I had attributed these differences to normal family variation, but now they seemed like obvious clues to a truth that had been hidden in plain sight. I thought about my childhood memories, trying to identify moments that might have been hints about adoption that I had missed or misinterpreted. There were gaps in Sarah's early childhood photos, periods where the family documentation seemed less complete than it should have been. I remembered my parents being evasive about certain questions Sarah had asked about her infancy, redirecting conversations or claiming they couldn't remember details that parents typically never forget. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that Sarah was the adopted child, not me. This would explain so much about our family dynamics, about the way my parents had always treated her like she was fragile and precious, while expecting me to be resilient and self-sufficient. They had been overcompensating for the guilt of adoption, showering her with attention and resources while assuming I would understand and accept my role as the less important child. But why hadn't they told us? Why keep the adoption secret for 25 years, allowing it to poison family relationships and create resentment that could have been avoided with honesty? I tried to imagine what it would have been like growing up knowing Sarah was adopted, how it might have changed the dynamic between us, and helped me understand why I always felt like an outsider in my own family. The following days were torture, carrying this monumental secret while interacting with my family as if nothing had changed. Sarah continued recovering beautifully, finally healthy and vibrant in ways she hadn't been for months before her liver failure. My parents continued their careful attention to both of us, though I now noticed subtle signs of anxiety in their behavior that I had previously attributed to normal post-surgical stress. I found myself studying their faces during conversations, looking for signs of guilt or deception, wondering how long they had been carrying this secret and what had motivated them to hide such fundamental information about our family structure. Did they think we would love each other less if we knew we weren't biological siblings? Did they believe that hiding the truth was somehow protecting us from emotional pain that would inevitably be much worse when discovered accidentally? Dr. Vasquez called me 3 days later to check on how I was processing the information and to remind me that she was available if I wanted to discuss options for moving forward. She mentioned that the hospital had social workers and counselors who specialized in helping families navigate unexpected genetic discoveries, and that these situations, while uncommon, were not unprecedented in the medical community. I finally decided I needed to confront my parents directly, but I wanted to do it privately, without Sarah present, so I could gauge their reaction and understand the full scope of what they had been hiding. I called Mom and asked if she and Dad could come to my apartment that evening for dinner, telling her I was feeling well enough to cook for them and wanted to show my appreciation for their support during recovery. They arrived promptly at 6 p.m., bringing flowers and a bottle of wine, clearly pleased that I was feeling well enough to host them. Mom fussed over my apartment, straightening pillows and offering to help with dinner preparation, while Dad settled into my living room chair and began discussing my return-to-work timeline and long-term career prospects. It was such a normal family scene, and yet I knew I was about to detonate a bomb that would change everything forever. During dinner, I made casual conversation about my recovery, about Sarah's progress, and about how grateful I was that the surgery had been successful. I was building up courage for the conversation I needed to have, trying to find the right moment and the right words to address something that would inevitably cause pain and disruption for everyone involved. Finally, as we were clearing the dinner dishes, I told them I needed to discuss something important that had come up during my medical follow-up appointments. They both immediately looked concerned, probably assuming I was about to share bad news about my recovery or some complication they hadn't been told about. I guided them back to the living room and asked them to sit down, because what I had to tell them was significant and required their full attention. I began by explaining that routine genetic testing during the transplant process had revealed some unexpected information about our family. I could see Mom's face immediately tense, and Dad's businesslike demeanor shifted into something more guarded and defensive. They knew, I realized, they had always known what the genetic testing would reveal, and they had been dreading this moment for weeks. Before I could continue with my carefully planned explanation, Mom broke down completely, tears streaming down her face as she looked at Dad with an expression of pure panic. She started talking rapidly, words tumbling over each other as she tried to explain 25 years of deception in a few desperate sentences. Sarah was adopted, she said. They had taken her in when she was 3 years old after her biological parents died in a car accident, and they had decided not to tell either of us because they wanted us to feel like a normal family. Dad took over the explanation with his typical analytical approach, detailing the legal process of adoption, the decision to keep it private, and their belief that knowing the truth would somehow make Sarah feel less loved or less a part of the family. They had convinced themselves that what we didn't know couldn't hurt us, that love was more important than biology, and that secrecy was a form of protection rather than deception. I listened to their explanation with a mixture of vindication and heartbreak, finally understanding the dynamics that had shaped my entire childhood and young adulthood. Sarah had been the favored child not because she was more worthy of love, but because my parents had been desperately trying to prove to themselves and to her that adoption didn't make her any less their daughter. In the process, they had inadvertently made me feel like the unwanted biological child, the one who was taken for granted because his place in the family was assumed to be secure. The conversation continued late into the evening, with my parents alternately apologizing and defending their decision to keep the adoption secret. They had been planning to tell us eventually, they claimed, but the right moment had never seemed to arrive, and as the years passed, the secret had become harder and harder to reveal. They were terrified of how Sarah would react, worried that learning about her adoption would traumatize her and potentially damage her relationship with them permanently. As I listened to their explanations and justifications, I felt a complex mixture of emotions that I couldn't easily untangle. Relief at finally understanding why I had always felt like an outsider in my own family. Anger at 28 years of unnecessary confusion and self-doubt. Sadness for Sarah, who was about to learn that her entire understanding of her identity was based on a lie. And strangely, a kind of compassion for my parents, who had clearly been trying to do what they thought was right, even though their choices had caused tremendous unintended harm. We agreed that Sarah needed to be told, but the question of when and how remained complicated by her recovery from surgery. Dr. Vasquez had suggested that major emotional revelations should probably wait until she was physically stronger, though she also emphasized that medical professionals discovering family secrets during routine care created ethical obligations that couldn't be ignored indefinitely. As my parents left that evening, promising to think carefully about how to approach Sarah with this information, I felt like I was finally beginning to understand my place in the world. I wasn't the disappointing son who had never lived up to expectations. I was the biological child who had been taken for granted while his parents poured their emotional energy into making an adopted daughter feel secure and loved. It was a painful realization, but it was also somehow liberating because it meant the distance I had always felt wasn't due to some fundamental flaw in my character or worth as a person. The next morning, I called Dr. Vasquez to update her on my conversation with my parents and to discuss the timeline for sharing this information with Sarah. She listened carefully to my account of their reaction and their explanation, then suggested that we schedule a family meeting in her office where the news could be shared in a supportive medical environment with counseling resources immediately available. As I prepared for what would undoubtedly be one of the most difficult conversations of our lives, I thought about the irony of the situation. I had given part of my liver to save someone who, it turned out, shared no biological connection to me whatsoever. But rather than making my sacrifice seem less meaningful, this revelation somehow made it more profound. I had acted out of love and family loyalty, not genetic obligation, and that choice revealed something important about who I was as a person regardless of biology or family dynamics. The family meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday afternoon in Dr. Vasquez's office, a neutral space where the truth could finally be revealed with professional support immediately available. Sarah arrived looking healthier than she had in months. Her color returned to normal and her energy levels dramatically improved thanks to my liver functioning perfectly in her body. She was expecting a routine follow-up appointment about her recovery progress, completely unaware that her entire understanding of her identity was about to be fundamentally altered. Dr. Vasquez had arranged for a counselor to be present during the discussion, anticipating that the emotional impact of learning about the adoption would be significant and potentially overwhelming. The office felt crowded with all 5 of us present, the tension palpable as my parents fidgeted nervously, and I tried to maintain my composure while knowing what was about to unfold. Sarah seemed to sense that something unusual was happening, her lawyer's instincts picking up on the formal atmosphere and the serious expressions around the room. Dr. Vasquez began by reviewing the success of both surgeries and our respective recovery progress, establishing a foundation of positive medical news before transitioning to the more complex genetic findings. She explained that routine compatibility testing during organ transplant procedures sometimes revealed unexpected information about family relationships, and that our case had produced results that needed to be discussed with the entire family present. When she announced that the DNA analysis had shown Sarah and I were not biological siblings, the silence in the room was deafening. Sarah's face went completely blank for several seconds, as if her mind was refusing to process information that didn't fit with everything she had believed about herself. Then she looked directly at my parents and asked the question that would change everything: which one of us is adopted? Mom broke down immediately, just as she had at my apartment, tears streaming down her face as she tried to find words to explain 25 years of secrecy. Dad took over with his typical methodical approach, explaining that Sarah had been adopted when she was 3 years old after her biological parents died in a car accident. They had made the decision to keep the adoption private, he said, because they wanted her to feel like she had always been part of the family without any sense of being different or less loved than their biological son. Sarah listened to this explanation with the kind of focused intensity she typically reserved for complex legal cases, asking detailed questions about the circumstances of her adoption, the identity of her biological parents, and the legal process my parents had navigated to become her guardians. But underneath her professional demeanor, I could see her struggling to reconcile this new information with her memories of childhood and her sense of identity within the family. Then she turned to look at me, and I saw something in her expression that I had never seen before: genuine recognition of what I had done for her. She was beginning to understand that I had given part of my liver not to save my biological sister, but to save someone who was essentially a stranger, someone my parents had chosen to love while taking my presence in the family for granted. The magnitude of my sacrifice was becoming clear to her in ways that went far beyond the medical procedure itself. Dr. Vasquez gently explained that from a medical perspective, my decision to donate was even more remarkable given the lack of biological relationship. Living organ donation between non-relatives was extremely rare, she said, typically requiring extensive psychological evaluation and legal documentation to ensure the donor's motivations were genuine and informed. The fact that I had undergone major surgery to save someone who shared no genetic connection to me represented an extraordinary act of selfless love. Sarah's composure finally cracked when she fully grasped what this meant. She had spent our entire lives believing she was the more successful, more worthy child, while I was the disappointment who couldn't live up to the family's expectations. Now she was learning that I was actually the biological son who had been emotionally neglected while my parents poured their energy into making her feel secure as an adopted daughter. And despite years of feeling invisible in my own family, I had still chosen to risk my life to save hers. The tears came then, not the polite crying of someone overwhelmed by medical information, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone whose entire worldview was collapsing and rebuilding itself in real time. She kept repeating that she was sorry, that she had never known, that if she had understood the family dynamics she would have treated me differently. But her apologies only highlighted how profoundly the secrecy had damaged all of our relationships over the years. Mom tried to comfort Sarah by explaining their reasoning for keeping the adoption secret, how they had believed that love was more important than biology and that knowing the truth would somehow make her feel less a part of the family. But Sarah, with her legal training and analytical mind, immediately saw through the flawed logic of their decision. She pointed out that their secrecy had created exactly the kind of family dysfunction they claimed to be preventing, making me feel unwanted while giving her a false sense of superiority that she had never earned. The conversation that followed was painful but necessary, as decades of hidden resentments and misunderstandings finally came to the surface. Sarah acknowledged that she had always sensed she was treated differently, but had attributed it to being older, more accomplished, or simply more naturally suited to our parents' expectations. She had never realized that their preferential treatment was actually a form of overcompensation for guilt about the adoption, and that their obvious favoritism had been psychologically damaging to me throughout our childhood and young adulthood. I found myself in the strange position of comforting the sister who had unknowingly benefited from family dynamics that had marginalized me for 28 years. Despite everything, despite the years of feeling invisible and unimportant, I felt genuine sympathy for her confusion and pain. Learning that your entire identity is based on a lie is traumatic regardless of the circumstances, and I could see that she was struggling to understand who she really was if not the biological daughter of our parents. Dr. Vasquez facilitated this difficult conversation with remarkable skill, helping us navigate emotions that ranged from anger to grief to relief as we all process the implications of the truth. She emphasized that family relationships are defined by love and commitment rather than genetics, but she also acknowledged that secrecy and deception inevitably create the kind of dysfunction we were now confronting together. The counselor present during the meeting helped Sarah understand that her adoption didn't make her any less a part of the family, while also helping my parents recognize how their decision to hide the truth had inadvertently created a hierarchy that privileged the adopted child at the expense of the biological one. It was a complex dynamic that would require ongoing therapy and conscious effort to repair, but for the first time in our lives, we were at least dealing with reality rather than the fiction my parents had constructed to protect themselves from difficult conversations. As the formal meeting concluded, Sarah asked if she could speak with me privately. Dr. Vasquez graciously offered to let us use her office while she walked my parents to the counseling center to schedule follow-up appointments. Alone together for the first time since learning the truth, Sarah and I finally had the honest conversation that probably should have happened years earlier, but had been impossible under the weight of family secrets and deception. She began by acknowledging that she had taken me for granted throughout our lives, assuming that my quiet acceptance of secondary status in the family was simply part of my personality rather than a response to being systematically overlooked and undervalued. She had never questioned why I seemed content to live in her shadow, never wondered if my apparent lack of ambition might actually be a form of self-protection in an environment where I was never going to be the favored child regardless of my accomplishments. Then she did something that surprised me. She thanked me not just for the liver donation, but for years of quiet support and kindness that she was only now beginning to recognize and appreciate. She mentioned specific instances from our childhood where I had defended her, helped her, or sacrificed my own interests for her benefit. Acts of sibling loyalty that she had previously taken for granted, but now understood were remarkable given how I was being treated by our parents. I told her that despite everything, despite the years of feeling like an outsider in my own family, I had never stopped loving her or wanting to protect her. The liver donation hadn't been a calculated decision based on family obligation, but rather an instinctive response to seeing someone I cared about in mortal danger. Learning that we weren't biologically related didn't diminish the significance of growing up together or the bond we had formed despite the dysfunctional family dynamics that had shaped our relationship. We talked about the future, about how this revelation would change our family interactions, and whether it was possible to build healthier relationships based on honesty rather than the fiction our parents had maintained for 25 years. Sarah was committed to therapy, both individual counseling to process her identity issues and family therapy to address the systemic problems that had affected all of us. She also wanted to learn about her biological parents, to understand her genetic and cultural heritage in ways that had been denied to her through decades of secrecy. When we rejoined my parents in the waiting area, the atmosphere was markedly different from when we had arrived. The secret that had poisoned our family dynamics for a quarter-century was finally out in the open, and while the immediate aftermath was painful and complicated, there was also a sense of relief that we were finally dealing with reality rather than pretending everything was normal when it obviously wasn't. Mom approached me with tears in her eyes and offered an apology that felt more genuine than anything she had said to me in years. She acknowledged that their decision to keep the adoption secret had been wrong, that it had harmed both Sarah and me in different, but equally significant ways, and that she was committed to rebuilding our relationship based on honesty and recognition of my worth as their son. It wasn't enough to undo 28 years of emotional neglect, but it was a beginning. Dad's apology was more formal, but equally important, as he admitted that his focus on Sarah's achievements and potential had blinded him to my own accomplishments and character. He said he was proud of the man I had become despite their failures as parents, and that my decision to donate my liver had opened his eyes to qualities of compassion and selflessness that he had somehow failed to notice or appreciate over the years. Over the following weeks, word of my story began to spread through the hospital where I worked, and the response from colleagues and medical staff was overwhelming. Dr. Vasquez had shared the basic facts of the case with the transplant team, and they were amazed by the circumstances surrounding the donation. Living organ donation between non-relatives was rare enough, but doing it without knowing the genetic relationship made my decision even more remarkable from a medical ethics perspective. The hospital's chief of staff asked to meet with me, not about my job performance or any work-related matter, but simply to express the institution's admiration for my extraordinary act of selflessness. He mentioned that in his 30 years of medical practice, he had rarely encountered such a clear example of unconditional love and sacrifice, and that my story would be shared in medical ethics classes as an example of the highest ideals of human compassion. My coworkers began treating me with a new level of respect and admiration that was both gratifying and slightly overwhelming. People who had worked alongside me for years were suddenly seeing me as someone remarkable rather than just the quiet technician who did his job competently but without fanfare. The recognition was validating, but it also highlighted how much I had been undervalued not just by my family, but by the broader community that had never really noticed my contributions. Sarah's recovery continued to progress beautifully, and she made a point of publicly acknowledging my sacrifice whenever anyone asked about her health improvement. She would tell people that her biological brother had given her a new chance at life, emphasizing the word brother in a way that made it clear our relationship was defined by choice and love rather than genetics. Her friends and colleagues began reaching out to thank me personally, many of them expressing amazement that someone would undergo major surgery for a non-relative. The most meaningful recognition came from Dr. Vasquez herself, who nominated me for the hospital's annual Humanitarian Award, an honor typically reserved for medical professionals who had made extraordinary contributions to patient care or community health. In her nomination letter, which she shared with me, she wrote that my decision to donate my liver represented the kind of selfless compassion that inspired everyone in the medical field to remember why they had chosen careers dedicated to healing and helping others. My parents began making genuine efforts to repair our relationship, though it was clear that rebuilding trust and affection after decades of emotional neglect would be a long and difficult process. They started including me in family decisions and conversations that had previously been limited to Sarah, and they began asking about my work, my interests, and my future plans with what seemed like genuine curiosity rather than obligatory parental concern. The change in family dynamics was most evident during our first holiday gathering after the truth had been revealed. Instead of the usual dynamic where Sarah was the center of attention while I remained on the periphery, my parents made conscious efforts to balance their focus and ensure that both of their children felt equally valued and important. It was awkward at times, as they overcorrected for years of ingrained behavior, but their intentions were sincere and their progress was noticeable. Sarah and I began developing a real friendship for the first time in our adult lives, freed from the competitive dynamic that had been artificially created by our parents' secret favoritism. She was genuinely interested in my work at the hospital, asking detailed questions about my responsibilities and expressing admiration for my knowledge of medical equipment and procedures. She had never realized that my job required extensive training and expertise, having always assumed it was somehow less demanding or important than her legal career. Aunt Linda visited again several months after the revelation, and she confided that she had suspected the truth about Sarah's adoption for years, but had never felt it was her place to interfere with my parents' decision to keep it secret. She expressed regret for not speaking up sooner, believing that honesty would have prevented much of the family dysfunction that had affected my childhood and young adulthood. Her validation of my perceptions and experiences was deeply meaningful, confirming that the favoritism I had sensed wasn't just my imagination or oversensitivity. As my physical recovery from the surgery completed and I returned to full-time work at the hospital, I found that my perspective on life had fundamentally changed. The experience of nearly losing Sarah, of undergoing major surgery to save her life, and of learning the truth about our family relationships had clarified what really mattered to me. I was no longer willing to accept being undervalued or overlooked, whether by family members or anyone else in my life. I began pursuing additional certifications in medical technology, realizing that I had been selling myself short professionally just as I had been accepting secondary status in my family. My supervisors were supportive of my educational goals, and several doctors I had worked with over the years offered to serve as references or mentors as I advanced my career. It was gratifying to discover that my contributions to patient care had been noticed and appreciated even when I hadn't been advocating for myself. The most profound change, however, was in my relationship with myself. For the first time in my life, I truly understood my own worth, independent of family dynamics or external validation. I had acted with extraordinary courage and compassion, risking my life to save someone I loved without any expectation of recognition or reward. That choice revealed something fundamental about my character that couldn't be diminished by years of being overlooked or underestimated. Sarah often mentioned to people that she owed her life to someone who had chosen to love her despite having every reason to resent her privileged position in the family. She would say that learning about the adoption had been painful but ultimately liberating because it had forced all of us to confront unhealthy patterns and build more authentic relationships based on choice rather than obligation or genetic assumption. Dr. Vasquez became something of a mentor to me, occasionally checking in about my recovery and my family situation, but also encouraging my professional development and suggesting opportunities for advancement within the hospital system. She mentioned that my experience as both a medical professional and an organ donor gave me unique insights that could be valuable in patient education and support programs for transplant families. The humanitarian award ceremony was held on a Thursday evening in the hospital's main auditorium, attended by medical staff, administrators, and several patients whose lives had been touched by the year's award recipients. When Dr. Vasquez introduced me and explained the circumstances of my liver donation, the audience's response was immediate and overwhelming. The standing ovation lasted several minutes, and I could see genuine emotion on the faces of people who understood the medical and personal significance of what I had done. In my brief acceptance speech, I talked about the importance of family, not just biological relationships, but the bonds we choose to create and maintain through love and commitment. I mentioned that learning the truth about Sarah's adoption had been difficult, but ultimately strengthening for our family, because it had forced us to base our relationships on conscious choice rather than genetic assumption. The experience had taught me that the most meaningful connections in life are those we nurture through action and sacrifice rather than take for granted because of blood relation. After the ceremony, Sarah approached me with tears in her eyes and hugged me with an intensity that conveyed everything she couldn't put into words. She whispered that she was proud to be my sister, adoption or no adoption, and that she planned to spend the rest of her life proving worthy of the sacrifice I had made for her. It was the first time in our adult relationship that I felt like she truly saw me as an individual rather than just the quiet brother who had always been part of the background of her more dramatic and successful life. My parents attended the ceremony as well, and their pride in my recognition was obvious to everyone present. Dad approached several doctors and hospital administrators to express his gratitude for acknowledging my contribution, and Mom spent much of the evening telling anyone who would listen about her son's extraordinary act of love and courage. Their public celebration of my achievement felt like a form of redemption for years of private indifference to my accomplishments. As the evening concluded and we prepared to leave the hospital together as a family, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in just a few months. I had undergone major surgery, learned a family secret that recontextualized my entire childhood, and received public recognition for an act of love that I had performed without any expectation of reward or acknowledgement. Most importantly, I had finally found my voice and my sense of self-worth in ways that would shape every future relationship and opportunity. The drive home was quiet but comfortable, all of us processing the emotional weight of the evening and the journey that had brought us to this point. Sarah sat in the back seat beside me, occasionally squeezing my hand as if to reassure herself that I was real and that our new relationship was genuine rather than another fiction created to avoid difficult truths. My parents chatted about the ceremony and the recognition I had received, their voices filled with the kind of pride and affection I had spent decades hoping to hear. When we arrived at my apartment building, Sarah asked if she could come up for a few minutes to talk privately. We sat in my living room drinking tea and looking through some of the family photographs that had taken on new meaning since learning about the adoption. She pointed out details in the pictures that now seemed like obvious clues about her different origins, but also moments of genuine sibling affection that proved our bond had always been real even when the family dynamics around us were dysfunctional. She told me that she had been in contact with a genealogist who specialized in helping adoptees research their biological families, and that she was learning about her cultural heritage and genetic medical history for the first time. But she emphasized that discovering her origins didn't diminish her commitment to the family we had built together, that she considered my parents to be her real parents and me to be her real brother regardless of genetics or legal documents. As she prepared to leave that night, Sarah said something that I will remember for the rest of my life. She told me that my decision to donate my liver had taught her what unconditional love really looked like, that watching me risk my health and safety for someone who had never fully appreciated me had shown her a standard of selflessness and compassion that she wanted to emulate in her own relationships. She said that having me as a brother, whether biological or chosen, was one of the greatest gifts of her life. After she left, I sat alone in my apartment feeling more at peace than I had in years. The family secret that had shaped and distorted our relationships for decades was finally out in the open, and while the healing process would take time and continued effort from all of us, we were finally building connections based on honesty and mutual respect rather than guilt and deception. I had given Sarah part of my liver, but in return, I had gained something equally valuable, a true understanding of my own worth and a family that finally saw me clearly. The recognition I had received at the hospital was gratifying, but the real vindication came from within, from finally understanding that I had always been worthy of love and respect regardless of whether others acknowledged it. My quiet strength, my willingness to sacrifice for others, my ability to maintain dignity in the face of dismissal, these qualities had always been part of who I was, and now they were finally being seen and celebrated by the people who mattered most. Looking ahead, I knew that our family would never be the same as it had been before the surgery and the revelations that followed. But that was a good thing, because the old family dynamic had been built on secrets and favoritism that had hurt all of us in different ways. The new relationships we were building based on honesty and conscious choice would be stronger and more authentic, even if they required more effort and emotional vulnerability than the comfortable fiction we had maintained for so many years. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about how the journey that had begun with Sarah's medical crisis had ultimately led to healing that went far beyond physical recovery. We had all learned something important about the difference between love and genetics, between family and biology, between sacrifice and obligation. Most importantly, we had learned that the truth, however painful initially, was always preferable to the most comfortable lie. I fell asleep that night knowing that I had finally found my place in the world, not as the disappointing son who couldn't live up to expectations, but as someone whose capacity for love and sacrifice had literally saved a life and transformed a family. The quiet strength that had sustained me through years of feeling invisible had finally been recognized and celebrated, and I would carry that validation with me into whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead.